Lady and the Wolf, Red Riding Hood, Tangled Tales Series, Book 1. Written by Elizabeth Rose. Narrated by Brian J. Gill. Produced by Griffin Audio Media. Chapter 1. Danger lurked in the forests of Dartmoor, and it went by the name of Lord Hugh de Bar. Lady Winifred Chaserton of Tavistock made her way on horseback through the woods. Sure she heard the soft pitter-patter of animal paws trailing behind her. The night was dark, and the forest foreboding. Branches reached out like the bony fingers of a harpy, trying to snag the cloak she wore, her grandfather's cloak. She'd taken it from his chamber, wearing it as a disguise should she be noticed as she left the protection of Castle Chaserton's walls. Without a torch to guide her way, Winifred kept to the rough path. She did not need a light, because she knew this trail by heart. It was a cool autumn evening, and the trees had started to turn to shades of blood red, amber yellow, and fire orange in the past few weeks. The winds lately had loosened many of the leaves, and they'd been dropping to the ground faster than enemies at the hand of her warlord grandfather, Baron Roland Chaserton. The horse's hooves crunched the dried leaves, and the sound of crickets filled the air as she bravely forged forward without an escort. No one knew of her whereabouts, except one guard back at the castle, who had sworn to keep her secret. With her crossbow slung over her shoulder and a quiver of bolts at her side, Winifred felt protected from any evil that might be lurking behind the trees, or following her. With a mission to fulfill, she wouldn't stop until she found her answers. Slowing her horse, she glanced over her shoulder, trying to get a glimpse of the animal that was following her. The night sky was occasionally lit by moonbeams spilling out from behind the passing clouds. The long cloak she wore fell over the sides of her white horse. It billowed out around her as she kicked her heels into the sides of her horse and rode hard through the forest. The damp night air felt heavy all around her. The breeze bit at her flesh, but its sting was naught compared to the teeth of the bloodthirsty wolf lying in wait somewhere in the shadows. Rumor had it Lord Hugh de Bar of Babeny was a wolf in disguise. He was said to be able to shift from the form of a human to that of a wolf at will. While in his animal form, he was not more than a bloodthirsty killer, looking for innocent young maidens to stalk. Or eat. She'd heard many stories of the infamous knight from traveling scribes. Each time the stories were told, the tale grew in enormous proportions. None of it mattered, because she refused to believe in such nonsense. She surmised these were only tales of terror, devised by her grandfather to keep poachers out of his forest, and to keep her inside the castle walls. Even if this man sounded darker than a midnight sky, she had nothing to fear. Her crossbow could take down a wolf from quite a distance. A snap of a twig from behind her told her that her assumption was correct. She was being followed. The light of the full moon broke through the clouds and lit the path, enabling her to see the way to her destination just up ahead. It was a place she passed by every day with her grandfather's men when they entered the forest to hunt. And every day Sir Bradley disappeared somewhere with a basket of food in his hands. Then he'd return, with the basket empty. She needed to find out where he went each day, and why he'd lied to her when she'd asked him about it. There was something he was hiding, and she had a feeling her grandfather was behind it all. Her grandfather, Roland Chaserton, Earl of Tavistock, was as ornery as the day was long. He was a brave warrior, but it seemed as if something about these woods had him spooked lately. It had been almost a year now since he'd set foot in the forest. If he knew she was making this trip in the middle of the night and unescorted, he'd probably send her off to a convent just to keep her locked away. That's why she'd waited until after her grandfather was well in his cups and fast asleep before she ventured out. In return for a kiss, the guard at the gate kept her secret. A small price to pay for the knowledge and discovery she'd gained from this little journey. The horse came to a stop, and Winifred listened intently. A low growl from behind her had her grabbing for the crossbow at her side. It was a small lady's crossbow, and much easier to load than a knight's weapon that would take more muscles to use than she had in her entire body. Her grandfather had his master craftsman construct it for her 5 years ago, when she'd turned 16. She'd been trained by the knights to use it, and could hunt just as well as any of her grandfather's men. With another growl and a snap of a twig, her horse became spooked and reared up, pawing the air with its hooves. She managed to stay mounted. Gripping her legs around the animal tightly, she regained control. "We're almost there," she said to the horse in a calm voice. At the same time, she grabbed for a bolt from the quiver at her side. A shadow darted through the underbrush, sending a shiver up her spine. It was a wolf. There was no denying that. Perhaps it was only a feeling, but something told her this was no ordinary wolf. Mayhap all the stories of Lord Hugh de Bar had filled her with fear, after all. Because suddenly, she couldn't get the silly notion out of her head that the Dark Lord of Babeny was stalking her. The last traveling bard at the castle told her Lord de Bar, or Wolf, as everyone called him, ate young girls such as herself out of nothing more than boredom on a slow day of battle. He was rumored to have bloodlust in his veins, and couldn't sleep nights unless he killed a girl a day. She only hoped the story wasn't true, because she didn't fancy dying any time soon, especially not before she could uncover her grandfather's secret. The girl would be a tasty morsel in more ways than one. Lord Hugh de Bar craved her body more than any man had the right to. Then again, he wasn't just any man. Right now, he was in wolf form. He was also a knight and a lord, and one of the most feared men in all of England. Sadly enough, over the past year, everyone had forgotten the man he used to be, and had started referring to him simply as Wolf. The Earl of Tavistock was to thank for his wretched reputation. The Earl and his witch. Wolf ran on all fours in his animal form, following the girl's trail through the woods. She'd passed him, wearing a long, dark cloak. He'd hidden behind a bush so as not to alarm her, so he'd seen nothing more. However, his senses were sharp enough that he didn't need to see her to follow her path. Through the darkness, he spied his companion wolf, his twin brother Arnon, just up ahead. With a small nod, he gave Arnon the signal to track her. Wolf's bloodlust had grown stronger in the past year. His soul, as well as his senses, were now tied to his cursed wolf form. There was nothing he could do to control it. When the moon was full, like it was tonight, everything within him felt intensified. His hatred for the man responsible for all this, Baron Roland Chaserton, was growing immensely. Each day for the past year, Wolf had imagined many ways to kill the Earl. He knew the man's scent perfectly. It was something he'd never forget, as it was embedded in his mind. The Earl had tortured him, as well as Arnon, when he'd taken them as prisoners of war. Tied, caged, poked, whipped, and left for dead, Wolf thought his life couldn't get worse until they'd also been cursed by the Earl's witch. To the Earl, a mere death in his dungeon wasn't enough. The man wanted them to suffer as much as possible until they died. He and Arnon would have perished in the dungeons of Tavistock if an anonymous person hadn't helped them escape. Yes, the Earl's scent was embedded in Wolf's mind. With it came the bloodlust as well as pain every single damned day of his life. The Earl never came to the woods any more, knowing Wolf would be waiting for him. Tonight was different. Wolf smelled the man's unforgettable scent, and he was no longer patient for his vengeance. Tonight, he'd kill the bastard. Hopefully, with the Earl's death, Wolf's curse would somehow be broken at the same time, as well as Arnon's. He ran after the girl, hoping the Earl was with her. But it didn't take long to realize the girl was alone. A sudden sense of disappointment immersed him. The rage pounding in his temples slowed, but the anger still flowed through him like a hot poker in his veins. The Earl's scent was strong tonight. Then, on the breeze, his senses picked up the scent of rosewater and honeysuckle as well. Damn! Now the girl had his lust growing as rapidly as his rage. Didn't she know how dangerous it was for her to come here alone? He could kill her in his wolf form, or even take her in his man form, right here in the woods. No one would be the wiser. It would sate his lustful appetite. And though the knight in him told him it wasn't a chivalric thought or deed, his animal instincts begged to differ. His thoughts melded with those of his twin again as he searched the animal's mind for a clear vision of his prey. Able to read Arnon's thoughts, Wolf knew the girl they followed had long red hair, a petite frame, yet a curvy enough body to tighten any man's groin just thinking of her. He thanked Arnon silently in his thoughts for this tidbit of information. But there was more. He stilled his thoughts to listen. She rode a white horse with an expensive tooled leather saddle. Its trappings bore a knight's crest of a chevron in the colors of red and gold. The upside-down V had 2 swords in the gold partition at the top, while a volant, or flying charge of an eagle, filled the bright red center. Wolf's heart leapt in his chest. This was the crest of the Earl. There was no doubt this girl was somehow connected to him. She also carried a basket with something inside. Throwing back his head, he sniffed the air with his long, wet snout. Just a whiff told him she carried sweetmeats, mutton, and freshly baked bread, along with some of the castle's finest wine. Food and drink of the nobles, and a horse with trappings bearing the Earl's crest, were all too tempting. The scent of the cloak on the wind was so strong, it was as if the Earl was standing before him right now. His senses reeled, threatening to consume him. Wolf continued forward, melding Arnon's thoughts with his own. They'd always been close, and could read each other's minds, as well as feel each other's pain. While Wolf was able to shapeshift, Arnon hadn't been so lucky. His brother was trapped in the form of a wolf, a curse far worse than his own. "Close in around the front of the girl," he told his brother in his mind. "I'll come around the back." As he quickly approached, he stopped in his tracks, coming through the foliage, and seeing her clearly now in the bright moonlight. Her back was toward him, but he noticed that she reached for something. When she lifted the object, his heart sank. This girl, this beautiful girl, was sporting a lady's crossbow. The only people who were allowed to hunt in these woods were the Earl's men, and the only woman he knew of who carried a crossbow was none other than the granddaughter of the wretched Earl himself. Wolf tried to send his brother a warning, but Arnon's anger for the Earl blocked his message. He felt Arnon's anxiety as his own. Wolf's steed was tied up nearby where he'd left it while in his human form. It would be difficult to try to shift back at a time like this, and he'd have to fight the urge to stay in wolf form. A plain tunic and hose, as well as his sword, were tied to his steed. The question was, would he have enough time to pull this off before the girl tried to shoot him or Arnon? He'd heard from his men she'd taken down quite a few wolves in the past year on the nobles' hunting trips. She knew how to handle a crossbow, and had no qualms about killing a wolf. He sat down on a bed of moss and closed his eyes, willing himself to shift. The change started, but he kept returning to his wolf form every time he lost his concentration. With the sickening stretching of his bones, the air became even colder as his fur disappeared. Before he knew it, he was covered in sweat. His body shook like a leaf. It usually took a few minutes to regain composure, and for his vision to clear after his shift. There was no time for that now. Naked, he pushed to his feet and stood on wobbly legs. 2 legs, as his body had returned fully to that of a man. "Lady Winifred," he whispered her name on the breeze, forging forward to collect his clothes from his travel bag. He donned them quickly and mounted himself in the saddle, turning his horse and heading to where his senses led him. right to the girl. He kept pace with her, hidden behind brush and trees, never letting on that he was there. All the while he tried to reach Arnon with his mind to warn him, but his body and senses were dulled right after his shift. Wolf was the most vulnerable at times like this, and felt more helpless than he'd ever felt in his life. It was late and dark. She continued forward on horseback, riding through the woods faster than she should without a torch to light her way. This girl was so naive not to be escorted by at least one or two of her grandfather's guards, and she was so stupid to wear a cloak drenched in the Earl's undeniable scent around wolves that wanted the man dead. He raced forward on his horse, feeling the wind in his long black hair. At the same time, he felt the wind against Arnon's face too. Wolf had little restraint right now, but his brother, being an animal and nothing more, had none. Arnon would kill the girl if someone didn't stop him. Rushing forward, Wolf only hoped he wasn't too late.